normal high tide is about 10 feet. Though they aren't directly linked to sea level rise, these extreme tides give us a unique glimpse of how shorelines will be impacted by sea level rise and climate change in the near future. If you want to see what flooding could look like in the future on a map, you can visit the Climate Ready Boston Map Explorer, shown here. This afternoon, we're going to show you what these king tides are doing today. We'll go to 4 locations around Boston. We'll go to the Fort Point Channel, Port Norfolk in Dorchester, and to 2 sites in East Boston. On a normal day when the tide is low, these shorelines look like this. Like that, exactly. If you have any questions, feel free to send them in via Zoom or Facebook, as we'll be monitoring both throughout the broadcast. And for our first stop today, we're going to head to the South Boston waterfront, where our Chief of Planning and Policy, Alice Brown, will show us the conditions under the Moakley Bridge. Alice?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Fort Point Channel. Behind me is the Tea Party Museum. And if I flip my camera around, I'm going to be showing you a few different things worth noting. So here's the Tea Party Museum again. The far side of the channel that's closer to downtown, the water is really high if you're used to being down here on a regular day. But you'll see that the tops of the harbor walk and the buildings themselves are actually elevated pretty far, and they're not probably noticing what the king tide is looking like. But I'm here to show you this area over here. And it looks really dark, like it looked dark in that other picture as well. But I'm gonna walk forward and show you that there's water coming up, not from the actual harbor, which is here, and the water is very, very high and greenish blue. But over here, you'll see that there's this flooding happening here. And over here, there's some people playing in this fun puddle. This puddle appeared just in the last 20 minutes. I came here earlier, everything was completely dry. This is seawater that's coming up under the harbor walk and splashing in this way. If we had more wind today, we would also see what my colleague Christian calls the Bellagio effect, as little bits of things sprinkle and sparkle out through the water. But right now it's just slowly seeping through any place that the harbor walk is lower than the water out here, which hasn't quite come over the banks. So again, this is what 12 feet looks like on a really still day. If we had more wind, I would expect that most of this would be completely flooded today. I'm gonna now turn it over back to Erin, who will introduce our next location.
Thank you, Alice. Next, we'll go down to Dorchester to hear from our communications director, Christian Murfeld, who is out Tenian Beach. Christian?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dorchester. So I'm actually here on the harbor walk in Dorchester at Tenian Beach. We're in the neighborhood of Port Norfolk. This harbor walk path is actually a popular path that cuts through Tenian Beach Park that connects the Neponset River Greenway from Milton to Mattapan, and on the other side, it connects down to UMass Boston, past Morrissey Boulevard, onto Carson Beach. As you can see around me, we're more flooded than Alice currently is in Fort Point Channel. I would imagine the grade here is just at sea level or slightly below. Right behind me, it would have been sort of show you a little bit. This is the sand lot that used to have a playground, the tot lot. The state DCR had moved the tot lot slightly higher elevation so that it's protected from regular flooding such as this. The park itself is in the shadow of the Southeast Expressway. It's in between the Expressway, Morrissey Boulevard, and the Neponset River and Squantum Channel. On really high tides like this, you have water coming in, and if you can see right behind me, there's a little bit of a sort of a knee wall that gets inundated by the incoming tide. A lot of people who have been using the harbor walk for running, for biking, had to find alternative paths to sort of navigate themselves around that. But as you can see here, the water extends well into the parking lot and forcing people to find alternative routes just to stay dry. Turning it back to you, Erin.
Thank you, Christian. Now we're going to head over to East Boston, where Kannan of Eastie Farm is standing by, and he's going to show us what the flooding looks like behind Central Square on the Chelsea Creek. Kannan?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to East Boston. And this area is part of Central Square. And let me reverse so you can see what I'm seeing. That's the Shaw's supermarket. And this is the current water level, right at the brink, not quite into the parking lot yet, but this is where it is. And it's going to continue to rise for the next half hour. I believe 2 o'clock is when it hits peak, and it will hit 12 feet about above what's called mean low water. There's some geese here. This is their territory. I should be careful not to be too intrusive. And you can see the water here right up against the brink. And as it rises, it will come into this industrial area and affect how the supermarket operates, how it gets delivery, and how any of the other administrative and operational work that they do in the back office that needs to be done here using this space. So another look at the water level with respect to where the land is. So again, this is the Central Square area of East Boston, right by Border Street, which is called so because it is borders the land and the water. And as I mentioned, it'll be about 12 feet, and 11.5 is considered, in terms of flood stages, an action flood. And if it exceeds 11.5, you're at action. So I would say we're hitting that stage today. If it goes beyond that, there is minor, medium, and major kind of flooding. We did hit a moderate level of flooding back in the January of 2018. It's not going to be at that level today. That was actually a storm. This, as was explained earlier, is just a simple king tide. But it could be a regular day in the future when we will have sunny day flooding disrupting industrial action in a neighborhood like East Boston, which is a peninsula and already affected due to its demographics in many ways, but likely to be more affected due to climate change. Back to you, Aaron.
Thank you, Kannan. One more site in East Boston. We're going to head down to the harbor side of East Boston, where Alex DeFronzo from Piers Park Sailing will show us what the infrastructure looks like down by the docks and in the park. Alex?
Hey, Aaron, thank you, and welcome everyone to Piers Park in East Boston. We're going to come down here to our gangways that lead down to the dock and show you how the tide is looking right now. So you can see there's a little bit of flooding going on. We're really right at high tide here today. And as you heard from the panelists, it's about 12 feet at high tide. So this is how people get down to our dock in Piers Park. I'll turn it this orientation so you can see. It's flooded right now, and I brought my ruler to check out what we're at. Just an inch over the ramp being accessible. So this is unusual for us, but becoming a more regular phenomenon for sure. In past years, so this park was constructed in 1995, and Massport paid for and built this park, and part of that included our docks here at the Sailing Center. And one of the unique features was that they were built to be ADA accessible at all points in the tide cycle. And that was 25 years ago now. And unfortunately, there has been enough sea level rise just in those last 25 years, close to 8 inches, that we're now at a point where during king tides, this concrete part of the pier floods, and even just regular astronomical high tides. And like many of the other people have said on the panel, this is a really beautiful day in Boston Harbor. There's hardly any wind. It's about 5 miles an hour. It's a sunny, bright day. And if the conditions were any worse, if there was more wind pushing more water into the harbor, or if there was any kind of storm surge from a nor'easter or another storm event, obviously this flooding would be much worse. And, you know, the ways that we're dealing with this are adaptation to try to change the coastline so that our neighborhoods are a little bit more resilient and ready for this floodwater. Mitigation, which is trying to slow down the effects of climate change. And resilience, which is making sure our community is ready for when these flood events happen. And one of the things we're concerned about here on resilience is that, you know, there are entry points that are of really critical need to the neighborhood where stormwaters will get into with even just a little bit more water than what we have here today. And that's the tunnel at 1A and then Bennington Street, which are the main ways that people are able to get out of East Boston. So with continued sea level rise and without adaptation, those will be flooding in the pretty near future. So adaptation, changing the coastline is going to help us by protecting those for a little bit longer into the future. By 2070, we're looking at about 36 inches of sea level rise. But, you know, just on a sunny day today, you can see there's flooding here. And what I was saying earlier, resilience, we're worried about this dock. You can see the pilings down at the dock are at the point where there's about 4 more feet until the dock would be floating up and over. And that's the same for many of the docks that exist around the harbor, which would make it hard for people to exit by water if there was a major flooding event. But that's all, and I guess if we have any questions, I'll turn it back over to you now, Aaron.
Great, thanks Alex for that report. If you are tuning in live, we're going to pivot now to answer your questions, which you can submit using the Q&A feature in Zoom or leave a comment on Facebook if you're watching there. I see 2 questions right now, which I'll, one I can answer right now, which is when is the high slack tide? That's at 1:40 p.m. today. Thank you, Alice. And the other question is, I'm going to read, and it says, doesn't everything we know about climate change projections in Boston suggest that we should have a moratorium on future building in Boston, more asphalt, more emissions? You know what I mean? Yes, we do know what you mean. And I am again going to turn to my colleague, Alice Brown, out in Fort Point to take a first stab at that one. Alice?
Hi there. So I think there's a question about, should we build nothing because of climate change, or should we build things that are prepared for climate change? And to date, the city of Boston has tried to figure out tools for addressing climate change that can prepare buildings for them. So they're actually working on new zoning that's specifically to address areas that are at risk of flooding. So you can find that on their website. They have design guidelines as well. And I think there will be a new evolving standards for where it's appropriate to build and how it's appropriate to build there. From in terms of global climate change and how Boston is impacting it, another part of the city is also working on that. If you check out the Environment Department's website, they have plans for reducing net carbon, having a 0 carbon impact in the future. You can check all of that out on the Environment Department's website. So the city is aware that you can't entirely just stop a city because of climate change, but they're both trying to address how we reduce our impacts on global climate change and how we prepare for those impacts here in Boston.
Thanks, Alice. One more coming in, and I think I'll go to East Boston to try to address this, as it asks about the impact on the blue line, in the T's blue line. Alex or Kannan, would you like to address that?
Alex, do you want to take it?
Sure. So during the 2018 storms where we had flooding with the nor'easter, the head house at the end of Lewis Street in East Boston was flooded, and you could hear the fans really struggling there that helped feed air into that tunnel. Kannan, I know you were there really at the height of that, so maybe you could talk more to it as well.
Sure. So MBTA is working on this, as is Mass DOT, from a large scale resiliency perspective, looking at all tunnels, all transportation, and how to make them resilient in the long term and how to respond to any acute events that may happen in the short term. So those are some of the organizations, in addition to what Alice mentioned, the city of Boston is involved as well. To get more information about this, I was there, as Alex said, in January 2018, when Winter Storm Riley brought in a ton of water into the neighborhood. Obviously, if you're facing northeast during a nor'easter, you get a lot more water pushed into you. That's what we saw in Quincy, Marshfield, Situate, also in our own South Boston Seaport district. Whereas in East Boston, we saw some of that effect, and it did come into some of the new development area that is on Lewis Street in East Boston, in the Jeffreys Point waterfront. And right now, we have another development there called Clippership. So Portside and Clippership, those two developments are there. That's where the water came. That's where the head house is that Alex just mentioned. And the water did get into the head house, and we could hear the motors whirring and struggling to operate. And I have a video of that. I could share that with the Boston Harbor News later, if you want to share it with all the viewers. But that flood and the wave action, we'd never seen waves in our harbor until that point. It was wave after wave coming in, and the water kind of got around the new developments and started to get into the greenway. So that level of problems, in addition to some of the backflow preventions not working, causing flooding like the ones Alice was mentioning, if it's not directly water from the ocean coming in, it's coming in through other means as the tide level rises. So those two things have caused some problems in the station. If you ever go to Aquarium Station, you could see some water seeping in as well, especially during storms. And I think all of this is known to all the relevant departments, and they're taking that into consideration. Quite likely, some of the tunnels will be closed and not made available at all during the storms, and others will hopefully be resilient by the time we have these storms and will be available. So I-90 is another tunnel that was built a little bit later and therefore has more resilience built into it. But as for the Blue Line, as well as the Sumner-Callahan tunnels, they are older and are likely to have a different way of tackling when the storm does hit.
Thanks, Kannan. Thanks, Alex. Couple more questions that have come in. Carlos asks if these areas that we're presenting are the most endangered due to global warming. Carlos, the Climate Ready Boston reports that people have mentioned, and which you can find on the City of Boston's website, have identified some of these areas as the most vulnerable to coastal flooding, particularly around East Boston and the Fort Point area, and Dorchester. So yes, that's one of the reasons that we are broadcasting live from these areas. Anne has asked what will be the effect of all the—
Aaron, can I just add to the location?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so if you don't follow Boston Harbor now, we have done at previous king tides lots of live reporting from Long Wharf. We consistently go to Long Wharf. It's one of the most vulnerable areas of the city because it was constructed over 300 years ago. So it's really low lying. It was trying to be above the highest tide in the early 1700s. The other locations we're showing you today are designed to highlight places that are going to be issues moving forward, where there are some issues today. But we hope to continue to broadcast from different locations at different king tides. And we encourage all of you, if you are on the coast, Aaron will give you more information at the end, but we would like you to help us document this. It not only helps our work and the work of our colleagues in East Boston, but it also helps the work of the Coastal Zone Management Program at the state that's trying to keep track of where different kinds of flooding occurs and what it really looks like. Because so much of what we work on is based on modeling, and data modeling is great, but it's not the same thing as knowing that there's a crack on one side of the harbor walk, even if it doesn't wash over the other side. So these little details we're capturing today are exactly the kinds of things that help planners better prepare for future storms.
Thanks, Alice. Alice, if you can stay on for a second, we have a couple of questions that I think might be appropriate for you. One is about what will the effect be on all the building activity around North Station, and then we head upriver and ask whether the locks at the head of the Charles prevent rising seas from inundating the back bay.
Wow, yes, those two things are actually closely related. The tides today on the whole Charles River are protected by that dam. And I can tell you that I saw some high tides over the last couple days over by the locks. And you can tell that the tides are much higher than usual if you're used to crossing over them. The North Washington Street Bridge construction means that I'm walking over the locks a lot more. But I will tell you that there are several feet to go, that there's plenty of space there today. And there are lots of engineers thinking about how we can continue to protect that area. Out here on the Fort Point Channel, meanwhile, a boat on the harbor has caused a huge wake, and all of the splashing in front of me just like flew up. It was really cool to see. Scary, but cool at the same time. So yeah, I think the North Station area is largely protected because it's inside of that Charles River Dam. And the parts that are built out on the water on the harbor side of the dam are actually pretty well elevated. So at this point in the development of Boston, a couple feet can make a huge difference. Where I'm standing right now, here is the area down here that was flooding earlier, and you can see the water is continuing to seep up in that area. But this is all uphill, so that by the time you get to Martin's Park over here, we've had easily 4 to 5 feet of elevation change. And so there's no water over here. There's a little bit of water out on the kayak ramp over in here. But by and large, this harbor walk is completely dry. There's several feet to play with. And again, those feet could be risky in a really extreme storm event. But for now, they're unlikely to have an impact on Boston. You just need that extra few feet of elevation.
Thanks, Alice.
Yeah.
Back to East Boston, we've highlighted some of the impacts on East Boston, but there is a question about what effect this, and I assume this is climate change and rising sea levels, will have on the East Boston harbor front. Somebody in East Boston want to tackle that?
I mean, of course, East Boston is going to be heavily affected by rising sea levels. The two real major pieces of infrastructure that are close by that need to be protected really immediately are the entrance to the tunnel and a substation that sits pretty close by on the airport that are within risk of flooding, in the very near term. And the projects that exist to address that, right here where we are in Piers Park, I can flip around. You can see everything on this. There's a fence right here that runs all the way along to the Roseland project, portside at East Pier Apartments, and it's quite a bit lower than the elevation of the park. And all of this is going to become the site of Piers Park 2. So this whole site will be elevated up about 4 feet from where it stands right now. That creates an entry point on Lewis Street, which is right now kind of the lowest and highest risk. So the city's also put in their plans to raise the elevation at the entrance of the Mary Ellen Welsh Greenway, and also has installed a base for a deployable flood wall there, which will help reduce the risk to those critical pieces of infrastructure. And then, along Border Street, there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done at elevating parcels along that entire stretch in East Boston.
I'd add to that, we have some of the most beautiful natural resources by the water. Naturally, they are formed like a marsh. Boston's largest salt marsh, called the Belle Isle Marsh, is situated in East Boston. It is shared between a couple of other towns, Winthrop and Revere as well. And as the sea level rises, we are likely to lose the marsh. The marsh has nowhere to migrate to, as it may attempt to do. So from Belle Isle Marsh, it may go to Belle Isle Bay, for all we know. So that's on one side, on the north side of East Boston, where neither of us is at this time, so we can't show you that. And on the sort of along the same lines, there's another creek that used to be connected to the inner harbor, but because of the landfill that was done in order to develop the area, and 5 islands that made up East Boston were connected, the creek is not as connected to the rest of the water bodies as it could be, and that could cause some complications as well on the creek side. So the natural resources protection part needs to be done as well, if not for protecting the biodiversity that's in these spaces, there are several species that are endemic to the eastern seaboard that depend on open spaces to hunt and whatnot, like the long-eared owl and the short-eared owl. There's the salt marsh sparrow, which has the salt marsh in its name, so it can't survive if the salt marsh isn't around. So the biodiversity is affected, but they also serve as storm buffers for us people who live right on the water. So we'd be losing the storm buffer, and we'd be losing habitats for several endangered species, and for migratory birds, they'll lose a point where they could stop and rest and feed and breed and all that. So it'll have a huge impact on our biosphere. At least our little biosphere here will be impacted heavily. And because it is global climate change, this is going to be the kind of impact that we're looking at around the world.
Thanks, Kannan. That's a really important point. There's not just, we need to think about resilience, not just of our cities, but of our natural resources as well. I'm going to kick it back out to Christian in Dorchester for an update. Christian?
Yep, so since I've been standing out here, the peak of the high tide has subsided. I can feel the sort of stream current dragging it back to the Neponset River, back out into the harbor itself. As you can see behind me, it's still quite flooded. The parking lot is still flooded. But I wanted to sort of again echo that sort of notion that on this beautiful, relatively still, calm day, the water has extended quite considerably into our infrastructure. There is a side road that connects over to a little service site for the MBTA, for the red line that connects to Quincy, that goes all the way down to Braintree. If you look at the climate ready maps, you can also see that there are some really low-lying areas over there too. So not only will the blue line infrastructure be impacted, is being impacted, but also the red line infrastructure is also something to be considerate of as well. In terms of access, for anybody who lives in this side of Boston, Morrissey Boulevard becomes quite often flood with high astronomical tide, where traffic comes to a little bit of a standstill, and some of the sidewalk does get covered too. So behind me, with the harbor walk flooded, people having to find other access ways, with the roads being flooded, we're very fortunate that today is a calm wind, not stormy day. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Christian, for that update. Couple of other questions. One about evacuation routes, and how is climate resilience thinking and ensuring that evacuation routes remain passable with sea level rise?
Thanks, Aaron. I think it's a super question, and Christian pointed out that there are places like Morrissey Boulevard that are actually more at risk than the tunnels, because the tunnel people, we know that the tunnels could be at risk, and so there have been people working on those for years to ensure that water doesn't get into them. In fact, the entrances to the blue line are actually fairly secure unless it's a really extreme tide. But the issue at the long wharf end is that all the infrastructure is built under this historic wharf, and so there's seepage that happens throughout. And so they're trying to figure out where all those different seepage points are and address those. The Callahan Tunnel and the Sumner Tunnel are also being evaluated really carefully. But as a collective whole, in terms of thinking about evacuation from the city, there are two events that have really shaped Boston's approach to and preparedness for extreme events. And neither of them happened to us directly, though one started here. So both the 9/11 terrorist attacks and Superstorm Sandy have led the city and the state really to do a lot of work in terms of preparing for evacuation. And so there's ongoing work happening constantly to ensure that there are routes, that there are backup plans. And one final note for those of you who watch things like the Houston floods during hurricanes, you see that water comes up and sits. There are a few places in Boston where a torrential rain could cause water to sit, but all the coastal flooding arrives and departs in the same way that we've got this king tide today, and in a couple hours, no one will even know that the water was this high.
Thanks, Alice. I just want to note for folks on the Zoom webinar that our great production person, Brittany, has posted links to the Climate Ready Boston maps and other information in the chat. So you can take a look there and find more information on this topic. One last question, I think, as we start to wrap up. is how long will the cement piers last with all the corrosion caused by the saltwater flooding? I don't know if we have any structural engineers who might answer that question.
I don't think we have any structural engineers on the call, but I do think that we have a lot of good, the same way that there are people who are constantly thinking about resilience that we haven't even thought of yet, whether they're at the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, whether they're at MassDOT or the MBTA. There are folks that are thinking about infrastructure. While there are usually some amount of steel inside of a concrete piling, as long as you keep the outside together, the concrete pilings, the granite stone seawalls, those will all be there for a while. I would say on your list of things to freak out about, the height of a piling is probably a greater risk of not being high enough. Like Alex showed that the barge could float off the top in an extreme storm. Many places have added additional height to their pilings. That's going to be a more pressing problem than is the piling hanging on.
Where I'm at right now in Piers Park in East Boston, you can see the pier that's going to become Piers Park 3. So we're going to have a lot of expansion here, more green space and more resilience for the East Boston waterfront. But this pier is over 150 years old. It was the Canard line in the late 1800s, was actively used for people to emigrate to Boston. But you can see the concrete piers there are still intact. Most of the wooden part of the pier fell down during Superstorm Sandy and continues to fall in. But that's also, that was transformed into the pier that you can walk on in Piers Park today. So those concrete and granite structures still stand over 150 years later.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm going to wrap this up now. We do, however, encourage you to share what the king tide looks like in your neighborhood. If you want to share photos at My Coast, Massachusetts, which is a portal for the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management to collect and analyze pictures and data relating to coastal events. You can see the URL on the screen now. Thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Yes, we can share the recording. Sorry, just to answer the final question, we can share the recording on our website. Thank you.